Hi, we're going to cover three quite distinct laws in the UK. Each, I just think you've got to go into an exam knowing enough to be able to answer a 4-marker, a 6-marker, or in the worst case, a 10-marker, maybe about a couple of laws. So you're not a lawyer, or you're not a lawyer yet, just about knowing enough about them to be able to write about in an exam. So this first law is a weird one because it's really an assortment of quite a few random things. I've only picked out 4 ones which I think are relevant to IT. So this law is the Protection of Freedoms Act, which came into effect in 2012, sometimes shortened to PoF. So like the Data Protection Act, this mostly relates to personal data. Now, one key thing relevant to us is about biometrics. Biometrics are measures of human characteristics, things like fingerprints, our voice, facial recognition, our DNA, things which are related to our body. And under this law, the police and also teachers, people working in education, have got to do a few new things which they didn't need to do before this law was passed. So the first thing police need to do is make sure they delete any biometric data for suspects who are released. So they might arrest somebody, they might fingerprint them, they need to make sure they delete that data if they are released without charge. And even for minor crimes, again, it should be deleted after a period of time. It's not clear how long that time is, but they should not be lingering onto things like DNA, things like footprints for years and years and years if somebody was convicted of a very, very, very minor crime. However, for serious crimes, they are allowed to keep biometric data, and as you'll know, they keep DNA so that if there are crimes in the future, they can compare it. So effectively, it kind of depends on the severity of the crime. They are allowed some biometric data, but only in serious cases. Now, teachers don't really collect DNA or fingerprints or footprints. We do occasionally collect fingerprints for things like canteens. Buying your food in your diner, you might use your fingerprint to buy it instead of paying cash. That's the main area which a school might collect biometrics. And parents must be able to consent to this. Schools will send a letter to parents asking for their consent before they do this. And also you, as the child, is able to also refuse this collection. So a small minor right related to schools. This law also covers a couple of other slightly random things. So you also need to have criminal record checks if you're working with vulnerable groups. So the most common one is a DBS check. This is an example for a doctor. You can see it says position applied for doctor. It doesn't say anything, so they haven't committed any crimes. Another example is for schools. So every teacher, every adult in a school will have to have a DBS check. And some minor crimes might show up and you might still be allowed to work. But the point being, well, if you did a serious crime, your head teacher should know about it, and so you don't get hired. So that's what this is for. Another thing which was passed in this law is a code of practice for public cameras. In the UK, we've got loads of cameras, loads of CCTV, and also cameras like ANPR, which the police use. It stands for automatic number plate recognition. And the code of practice is not very interesting. It's usually things like where do they locate it, what type of cameras should be used. But effectively, they added a bit more strictness when it comes to public cameras. So 3 relatively random things in this law. The Equality Act is maybe a bit more simple to understand. This is all about protecting people from discrimination. So discrimination is treating somebody unfairly for no good reason. And specifically under this law, you cannot treat anybody unfairly because of a protected characteristic. So the government published a list of characteristics which it is illegal to treat somebody unfairly because of these. Some are quite obvious, maybe some are a bit less obvious, but that is the list. No need to memorise it, but I think having 3 or 4 in your head is important, although like I say, they're quite obvious, I would say. For disabilities, disability is very broad, but under the law as well, you've got to, as an employer, make reasonable adjustments to support with this disability. It's why, for example, in some exams, certain people might have extra time to support them. Equally, if somebody had a physical disability, they might be allowed to use a lift, or they might install a disabled ramp or something like that. That would be a reasonable adjustment. So to give a couple of examples, it would be illegal to choose not to interview somebody because they're not married. That would be unlawful because of your marriage status being a protected characteristic. Whereas you'd be perfectly entitled not to interview somebody because they had slightly rubbish GCSE results. That is allowed, right? Your results are not a protected characteristic. So it only applies to these list of characteristics. And it can be quite hard to prove whether you've been discriminated against, but if you have got a clear bit of evidence, you are able to claim this discrimination in court, and it can be quite serious if a person or a company has broken this. And in fact, if a crime was committed based on these protected characteristics, it becomes incredibly serious because it becomes a hate crime, which you might have heard of that term. These are very, very serious crimes because of one of these protected characteristics. The last law I want to cover, again, is kind of disconnected to the other two, but it just sits on its own, is the PECR, which stands for Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations. This is, again, not too dissimilar to the Data Protection Act in some sense, but it's much more focused on privacy, as it says in the name of the law. So this law just adds a few things which just you need to learn for the exam. It means that in order to receive direct marketing, you must have opted in. This means you must have given permission to be contacted. That's what direct marketing is. It's when a company contacts you with often things like offers or advertising. You might get occasionally junk mail through the post, which you're not really meant to be getting unless you have opted into this. You know, if you buy a takeaway online, often you've got a tick a box to say you don't want to get their communications. Well, again, they're only meant to give it to you if you have specifically ticked that you're happy to get this communication. Also, if an organisation is sending you stuff or they're calling you up, they need to identify themselves when they contact you. I think in the past you might get people calling you up without really saying who they're from, and it would be sort of a little bit intimidating, whereas now companies have to be really, really clear who they are. And also it's sort of was covered by the Data Protection Act many years later, but this law also meant that the purpose of cookies on web pages must be explained. A cookie is a small bit of data on a web page. Often it's there to kind of keep track of whether you're logged in or not, to keep track of the items in your basket, usually small things like that, and they must explain the purpose of these somewhere on the web page. Although really, the Data Protection Act and GDPR have really covered this as well.